Hey, my name is Lance, and in this video, I'm going to be walking through how we can migrate a WordPress website from GoDaddy's Classic Hosting, sometimes called Legacy Hosting or 4GH Hosting, over to cPanel, which is the modern hosting servers that GoDaddy provides. I'm not going to dive too much into why you would do this, other than I will say cPanel is dramatically more powerful. It supports the most recent versions of PHP, whereas the legacy servers are maxed out at PHP 5.6. For frame of reference, the most current version of PHP as of the time of this video is 7.2. So 5.6 to 7.2, it's a little bit of a big difference there. So for WordPress websites, or really any website that runs on PHP, you're pretty much always going to want to be on cPanel. There's a lot of other benefits, on top of the simple fact that cPanel is a lot easier to navigate, and it provides you with a lot more tools to do whatever it is that you need to do. The legacy hosting servers, I'm sure they were great at the time when they had originally come out, but at this point, they're like a 10-year-old laptop. It's time to upgrade. So in order to do the migration, I've borrowed a friend's account here. I'm going to be migrating the website topshelf.delivery. That's not my website, but it'll serve for the demonstration purposes of this video. So there's going to be a variety of steps to go through in order to get this all done, and we're going to go through everything step by step. The only thing that I cannot demonstrate in this video is that in this case, the cPanel has already been set up. The other thing that I will mention is that I am not going to be migrating the primary domain name. So as you can see, the primary domain name on the cPanel is nvrek.com. In this case, I'm actually going to be migrating an add-on domain name. So it's going to be topshelf.delivery, which is going to be listed as an add-on domain onto the cPanel. That's not really super important, but it will slightly change a few things. So for example, the primary domain name on cPanel, all the website content for that is going to go into the public_HTML folder. Add-on domains are going to go into the public_HTML/ folder name here. So for example, if I was migrating topshelf.delivery, I'm probably going to put that into a subdirectory public_HTML/ topshelf.delivery. So if you're confused by that at all, the takeaway is that primary domains, the website contents, go into public_HTML folder. Add-on domains will go into public_HTML/ add-on domain name here. That's really the only main difference about what we're going to be going through in this video. Otherwise, all of these steps are going to be basically the same. The other thing that I will mention is that in order to set up the primary domain name on cPanel, like let's say, as you can see, we've already done this step. So on this legacy hosting, the primary domain name had been nvrek.com. In order to free that up and change it over to the cPanel, you have to first get rid of it on the old hosting. So what we had done is we popped into the hosted domains. We had checked the primary domain. Like I said, in this case, it's showing as old.nvrek.com, but at the time, it was just nvrek. When you check the box for it, you get a change primary button that lights up, and you can just type in whatever you want. So let's say that the domain name was just domainname.com. Let's say that was the primary. In order to free that up, we would change it over to dev.domainname.com or old.domainname.com. It really doesn't matter what you type in here. It just has to be something /.domainname.com. So what we had wound up choosing was old.nvrek.com, and that allowed us to change the primary domain. That way we could reattach the primary domain onto the cPanel. Basically what I'm getting at here is that cPanel will not allow you to have a domain name attached to it if that domain name is already attached to a different hosting plan. So if you're trying to set up your hosting on the cPanel and you're getting domain name errors or something like that, and it's not allowing you to choose the domain name that you want, first make sure that you've deleted or changed the domain name on the old hosting. Now in this case, since we're actually working on an add-on domain here, rather than having to change the domain name, I'm actually just going to remove it. So topshelf.delivery is currently hosted in the control panel, or the hosted domains on the old control panel. I'm just going to click on remove topshelf delivery, and you'll get a pending removal text here. Now I'm doing this at the beginning because This process can take quite a while. These legacy servers move really, really slow depending on the changes that you're attempting to make. So I would rather get that started at the beginning of this video. That way we don't get hung up on it later in the video. This process, this pending removal, can take anywhere from about 5 minutes to 4 hours. And I'm being serious there. It's very, very random. So we're going to just start that process at the beginning. If you are not doing an add-on domain, you would want to make sure to change the primary to something at the beginning of this video, and once again you'll get like a pending change message there. Same time frame. It could be as little as 5 minutes, it could be as much as 4 hours. So let's get that done at the beginning of the video. One side note I do want to make just before I move forward here is that if you check the primary box, it's always going to have that star, but this box to change primary, this button does not light up. It's because you have an SSL attached to the website. So you will need to remove the SSL from your existing website. In order to do that, you can just revoke the SSL, or you can rekey the SSL to attach it to a different domain. So that's what I would highly recommend, because revoking actually gets rid of your SSL, so that's probably not what you want to do if you've already paid for it. So you would want to rekey the SSL to a different domain name. And that's totally fine. There's GoDaddy guides on how you can do that, so I'm not going to dive too far into that on this video. But just to give you a heads up, let's say that you were bumping into that issue. Let's just say that you had the primary domain was covered under an SSL, and so you couldn't change the primary on it. What you can do is, when you're setting up your cPanel, rather than setting it up under just the primary, which in this case was nvrek.com, you could set it up as staging.nvrek.com or dev.nvrek.com or new.nvrek.com. Once you have the cPanel set up with that new domain name, you could rekey your SSL and attach it to the temporary domain name, because you can rekey an SSL over and over and over. So all you really need to do, if you have an SSL attached to your old hosting platform, is just set up the cPanel with any sort of temporary domain name, rekey your SSL so that it attaches to this one, the new domain on the cPanel, and once that's done, it'll take the SSL off of the old hosting, and you can then change the primary on that old hosting. Like I said, in this case, that's not really applicable to this video, but that is how you would do it, just in case you do bump into that issue. Now, with all that said, we've got the pending domain name removal already in process on the legacy hosting. So the next step is to get it added to the new hosting. So we're going to go to our web hosting section of the GoDaddy control panel. You can always find this under the My Products section. You'll see it in the top left. It'll say My Products with a green underline, or you can click under the top right, click on the little person, and then click on My Products from the drop-down. From there, you go to your web hosting. In this case, we're working on the cPanel, so we're going to click on Manage. Now, before I go any further, I do want to highlight that the old hosting is Windows, and this new hosting is cPanel. That's totally fine because it's a WordPress website, and there's just going to be one change that we're going to make at the end of this video. If your old hosting is Linux rather than Windows, then the change I'm going to make at the end of this video will not apply to you, so sweet, the move from the old hosting to the new hosting is just going to be even easier. Now, with that out of the way, let's hop into the Manage button for cPanel. And this is going to be the cPanel GoDaddy panel. We need to get into the actual cPanel admin dashboard. So we're going to click under the top right. We're going to click cPanel admin. It's a big blue button. And this is going to be our cPanel admin area. Now, as a heads up, I know for a fact that GoDaddy is changing the layout. They are changing the theme or the skin of this cPanel dashboard in the very near future. So I'm going to try to make this video as applicable as possible, regardless of theme, because I know it's going to look different if you watch this video maybe 2-3 weeks after I initially publish it. The search bar in cPanel is going to be there regardless of the theme that you're using, or regardless of the way that cPanel looks. So we're going to hop in there. We're going to type in add-on domains, because as I said, we are migrating an add-on domain. If you're working on the primary domain, then you don't really need to go through this step, but just in case, what we're going to be adding is that topshelf.delivery domain. Now, obviously, you want to type in your domain here. So if your domain was domainname.com, that's what you would type, except there's one thing that we need to do. The domain name removal from the old hosting has probably not finished yet. So we're just going to create this under a temporary domain name. So we're going to make this new.domainname.com. So in this case, it would be new.topshelfdelivery. And from there, it's going to fill in these other boxes automatically. Now, the subdomain doesn't really matter, but the document root kind of matters. It's not super important, but I would recommend when you're setting this up, add-on domains, as I had mentioned earlier in the video, are always going to go into the public_HTML/domainname.com folder. Now, we're not going to be keeping the domain name as new.domainname.com. We're going to be eventually just making it domainname.com. So when you're creating this add-on domain, it's going to want to type in whatever you put in front, whether it's new dot or dev dot. I would recommend deleting that from the document root. That way, it's going to be easier to identify after the fact. If you don't do this, it's not a huge deal. It's not going to affect your website. You just need to make sure that you're paying attention to where you are migrating the files later in this video. So I tend to just prefer to set it up this way, where it's public_HTML/ the end domain name that we are eventually going to have at the end of this video. So once you've done that, you've manually edited that document root so that it doesn't have new dot in front of it. We're just going to click the green Add Domain button. Like I said, the button may look a little bit different when GoDaddy rolls out that change, but it's not a huge deal. As you can see, the add-on domain has been created. If you would like to manage the files for this domain, you can go here. We don't really need to do that right now. Instead, we're just going to go to the cPanel home. And what I would like to show you is what this actually looks like. So I'm going to type in file into the search so we can get to the file manager. We're going to go to the web root, which is going to be actually, let's go to the home directory here. And we're going to check the box for show hidden files, and we'll click go. Now this has brought us into the absolute root of everything. However, we're actually going to be working in the public_HTML folder. So we'll double click that. And as you can see, this already has some stuff in this. These files right here, the WP admin, WP content, WP includes, etc. These are the files for the primary domain. As I've mentioned repeatedly throughout this video, the primary domain website files go into the public_HTML, but any add-on domains go into their own folder. In this case, this website already has, or this hosting plan already has, one add-on domain I've finished migrating already. It's localbtm.com. So if we hop into that, you can see what it looks like. You've got WP admin, WP content, etc. It almost looks the same as the other structure, but that's because they are both WordPress websites. This is just to show you what it looks like. So if we had all of these files in the public_HTML, then we would have duplicates and the websites wouldn't load properly. That's why primary domain goes into public_HTML. Add-on domains need to go into their own folder, otherwise the hosting server won't know how to load the websites properly because there's going to be duplicate files. In this case, we've added topshelf.deliver. This is going to be the domain name that we're working on in this video. And you can see that the folder is basically empty. This is exactly what we should expect. This CGI-bin folder, that's a cPanel folder that is necessary in order to load it properly. So that's the only thing that you should see in here once you've added your add-on domain. If you were doing this on the primary domain, it would be the same thing. All this other stuff would be empty, but you would still see a CGI-bin folder. All we're really doing here is confirming that the folder was added properly. So we can exit out of that. We don't really need to be in the cPanel for right now. Currently, we need to go back over to our GoDaddy tab. That's usually going to be to the left of your main cPanel tab. And we need to get into our legacy hosting, because at this point, we need to actually start downloading the files that we are going to be migrating into this new cPanel hosting. So little person in the top right, let's go to My Products. Let's go to Web Hosting, click on the words Web Hosting to expand. And we need to hop into our old legacy hosting. We're going to go to Manage. And there's a few things that we need to do here. The first is that we need to back up the database. So any WordPress website is going to run on a MySQL or MySQL database. MySQL is pronounced MySQL, so throughout this video you're going to hear me say MySQL. I'm talking about MySQL databases, so try not to get lost with me on that one. Anyways, we're going to click on the databases from the left-hand control panel, and we need to find the database that says WordPress and then the domain name that we're working on. In this case, we are looking for WordPress and then top shelf delivery. So this is the actual database that we need to back up. So we're going to click on Actions. It's going to expand, and then we're going to click on Backup. What this is going to do is it's going to create a backup of the database, and it's going to put it into the root_db_backups folder. So we can't really modify any of this stuff, which is fine. We just need to click OK, and it's going to start backing up the database. Perfect. Now, while that's running, we're going to start downloading the files for the website. In order to manually download the files for the website, the fastest way to do that is through FTP, or File Transfer Protocol. In order to do that, we need an FTP client. So we're going to use Filezilla. So when you Google it, you can either go straight to the Filezilla website, or usually it'll have a download option. Odds are you're on Windows 64-bit. You're going to download the proper version of Filezilla for whatever system you're on. In this case, I'm on Windows 64-bit. It's going to ask if you want Pro or Standard. Pro is a paid version, I believe, so I'm just going to go with the standard one. And we're going to download this file. That went through pretty quick, so I'm going to open it. And this is going to allow us to install Filezilla as soon as the window appears. Now it's going to ask, license agreement, stuff like that. You just click I agree. It's going to ask to load data. Do you want to use it for you, anyone on the computer? I'm just going to use it for anybody on the computer. It's going to ask you which extensions you want. I would recommend leaving these by default. It'll ask you where you want to install to. Once again, I would leave that by default. Choose a start menu folder, leave it as default. This is where you get some bloatware. Now, bloatware is not a virus per se, but it is unnecessary crap that you probably don't want installed on your computer. It's not going to do any harm, it's just going to take up space, and you probably don't need it. Now, by default, it's going to have this box checked for McAfee, or you might get different bloatware depending on what you're seeing when you go through the installer. I don't really want McAfee on my computer. I'm not a McAfee fan, so I'm going to uncheck this box. And then I'm going to click Next. That's going to make sure that I don't install that. Same thing, it's asking me if I want Avast. I've already got an antivirus, so I'm going to uncheck this box. I don't want Avast. We'll click Next again. And then we are good. Now, I don't really have anything else to do here, so I'm going to start Filezilla right now. And then you get this window. Now you're like, wait a minute, what is all this stuff? The left-hand top left box is going to be your computer's file structure. And this box down here in the bottom left are the files that are in this directory. So in this case, I'm in my desktop. The only files on my desktop are desktop.ini and real desktop. As you can see, that's literally all I've really got here other than the recycle bin. So this is displaying properly. What we need to do is we need to connect to the FTP of our old hosting in order to download the files for the website. Now, depending on your setup, you're either going to have just an IP address or you're going to have a dedicated IP address. If you have a dedicated IP address for your legacy hosting, you're going to want to connect to that. So we're going to copy that IP address and we're going to paste that into the host. You always want to use the IP address when connecting through FTP because it runs a lot smoother. Next up, we're going to need the FTP username and password. To grab that, we can go upwards here in the GoDaddy side to FTP users, and it's going to have a variety of users. In this case, all we need is any admin user. What's an admin FTP user? Well, it should have access to all folders. In this case, you can see all three of these FTP users have the access necessary. I'm just going to use Lance22. Let's copy this, paste it. That's the username. Now, the last thing we need is the password. I already know my FTP password, but just in case you don't, you can go to where it has your users, you can click actions, and you can click change password. And you can start typing in, whatever you want as long as it meets the password criteria. I don't need to actually change my password here, so I'm going to close out of that, and I'm going to type in my FTP password. The port you can leave blank, although I will say the technical port that you could answer is 21, and even if you just hover over it, it'll say the default for FTP is 21, the default for SFTP is 22. These legacy hosting servers use standard FTP, they do not use SFTP, which stands for secure FTP. So we're going to use port 21, or like I said, you can just leave it blank, and we're going to click connect here. It'll give you a bunch of stuff here, and now we've got some stuff on the right hand side. All of this stuff on the right is the hosting server. So left hand side is your computer, right hand side is the hosting server that you have connected to. Now in this case, we're going to use the root here, and we're going to navigate over to Top Shelf Delivery, or the folder for it. In this case, if I click on Top Shelf, because that sounds like the correct folder, I can see a bunch of files. This looks like WordPress files. I've got WP admin, WP content, WP includes, so I know that I'm in the correct folder. Sometimes what will happen is you'll go into what you think is the correct folder, but suddenly it's empty. So make sure that you're actually finding the correct folder that has the files that you need. In this case, it's just going to be Top Shelf for me. So what I need to do here is I need to basically just copy this file right here, and I'm going to drag this over to my desktop. What this is going to do is it's literally just going to copy all the files in this folder on the hosting server over to my desktop. Now this process takes quite a while, depending on the size of your website. If you're on a very small website, such as this one, it's really only going to be maybe 10 megabytes, so this should go fairly quickly. However, if you have a very large website, such as a website that has e-commerce on it, or if your website has a lot of comment spam, that can blow up the size of the website as well. So just be aware that this process is going to be dependent on the size of the website as well as your internet download speed. So I'm going to let that run in the background, and I'm going to check on the databases. It's looking like the databases have already backed up here. So in order to download that, I could do that through FTP, but since it's already in the process of downloading some stuff here, I'm going to download it through the built-in file manager that comes with the legacy hosting panel. And remember, when we create a database backup in the legacy hosting, it is always going to go into an _db_backups folder. So I'm just going to click into that folder, and you're going to see the database that you had backed up. Make sure you're getting the name right, obviously. So this was a database backup for a different website that I've already migrated, and this is the database backup that is actually related to topshelf.delivery. So we need to download that. And when you go to download, it's probably going to ask whether you want to open or download it. In this case, I would rather download it. Opening it does nothing for me. So I'm going to save that file. And that download, it might take a little bit, depending on your internet speeds, like I had mentioned before. So at this point, we're just going to play the waiting game. We need for the database to download, and we need for the file transfer to finish downloading. Now, I'm glad I double-checked over here, because this is something that you will probably see when you are downloading the files through FTP. It's going to say, this target file already exists. Here's the source file. It's going to have a date, and then it's going to have a target file with a different date. In general, I always recommend choosing overwrite if source is newer. This is going to ensure that you are only downloading the most recent version of that file. If the website is up and running currently, then theoretically the most recent version should be the version that works. If you were to use skip, then you would actually get the old file, which may cause errors on your website once you have finally finished migrating things. So I'm going to overwrite if source is newer, and I'm going to select to always use this action because generally speaking, when you're downloading the website, there's a good chance that you're going to get this box popping up for numerous files. So I'm just going to always use this action. That way it does this for all the files that it's trying to download, and so I don't have to keep clicking that box over and over and over. Now, as you can see, in this case, the website has actually turned out to be drastically larger than I had originally anticipated. That's not a big deal. It's just going to take a little bit longer to download. So I'm going to pause this video here, and I'm going to come back once everything is finished downloading. Alright, perfect. So now that we've actually got all of the files downloaded, you can see that the file transfer is done in Filezilla. And when I check on my SQL file, the database that I had downloaded, we can get started here. At this point, we're basically going to be done for the most part in this old legacy control panel. There's not really going to be much left for us to do in here. You can even see that the domain has been removed for topshelf.delivery, so we're pretty much not going to be touching this very much for the rest of this video. So let's go ahead, go to the person in the top right. Let's go to My Products. And let's scroll down to our web hosting, and we're going to hop into the cPanel. We're going to click the Manage button. And we'll go into the cPanel admin area. Now, once we are in the cPanel home, there's one thing that I want us to do before we upload the database. And that's going to be increasing the PHP settings. The reason we're going to do this is that sometimes, depending on the size of the database or whatever that you're uploading, cPanel may time out, meaning it'll process for a little while, but if the database is really, really big, it'll time out. Now, one way to avoid this is to increase the PHP settings. That way you can tell cPanel, hey, make an exception for these really large files, just let them go through. So how do we do that? We're going to use the search bar, we're going to type in PHP, and we're going to look for select PHP version. Now on the top right, we're going to have switch to PHP options, so let's switch over to those. And this is where it's going to allow us to increase some of the PHP settings. So the important ones to increase are going to be upload max file size. If you hover over it, it's literally going to tell you what it is. In this case, it's the maximum size in bytes of an uploaded file. I know for a fact the database is larger than the 32 megabytes that it's set to by default, so I'm just going to max that out to 1 gig. The database is not 1 gig in size, but you know, just to play it safe, we'll go to 1 gig. The other one we're going to want to increase is the memory limit. This is just to make sure that the database tool can use as much memory as it needs in order to process the database that we're going to be uploading to it. By default, it's set to 128 megabytes. We're going to increase this to 512 megabytes. And the remaining one is going to be max underscore execution time. By default, this is going to be set to 30 or 30 seconds. I'm going to increase this to 300, which would be 300 seconds. Now, a lot of the times, this is actually not going to be necessary. However, in fact, for the database that I'm uploading, odds are I really don't need to actually increase these settings, but just because you watching this video may be uploading a larger database or something like that, I wanted to show how you can increase these settings just in case the default settings on the GoDaddy cPanel aren't high enough. So we're going to leave these saved here. We're going to click the save button in the bottom left, and you should see settings saved. Now, one thing I want to mention before I move forward, just in case you forget, once you have everything uploaded to your cPanel here, change these settings back to the defaults. These settings are low for a reason. For example, max underscore execution time. It's the maximum amount of time a script is allowed to run before it's terminated. We want that to be low. For example, let's say that you have some bad coding on your website, or one of your plugins is acting weird and it's executing bad scripting. Basically just poorly coded stuff that is not running properly. You want that to get killed off quickly. You do not want bad scripting running for more than 30 seconds, for example. Because if you do let it run for a really long time, it's going to eat up your computer or your hosting resources. Not in a permanent way, but what it basically does is if a bad script is allowed to run for too long, it'll start using up resources such as the RAM or the CPU processing power, and that winds up slowing down all of the other scripts that your website needs to run. Because your website doesn't just run one script at a time, it's usually running several scripts simultaneously. So you don't want one bad script to hog up all the resources, because it'll either slow your website down or it can even crash the website. So the same thing goes for the memory limit. You don't want one script to be able to use all of your memory. There's a reason it's set to be 128 by default. So once this is done uploading, change it back to 128. The exact same reason applies. You don't want bad scripting hogging up your hosting resources and either slowing your website down or crashing the website. Upload max file size is another similar one. You don't want scripting uploading things in a bad way. So if it's adding extra code because, like I said, maybe the plugin or whatever is just broken or halfway broken and it's just adding a bunch of extra data, you don't want it to be able to upload massive files that take up a ton of space on your cPanel hosting. So long story short, change these back to the defaults once you are done. But for right now, we're going to leave them maxed out so we can do the database upload. So let's get back to the cPanel home. Now from the cPanel home, we're going to be using the backup tool. So let's type into the search bar, backup, and we're going to use the backup tool, not the backup wizard, just the one that says backup. If you go towards the bottom right, you're going to see an option to restore a MySQL database backup. That's that database that we had downloaded earlier. Now the one thing we want to double check before we do this is we want to open up the database and make sure that a certain line of code is not in there. In order to actually open that database file, we're going to want to use a program called Notepad++. So let's go ahead and download Notepad++. Similar to before, you're going to want to make sure that you're downloading the correct version. In this case, I've already verified earlier in the video that I am using a 64-bit version of Windows 10. So I'm going to use the 64-bit installer. I'm going to download it and save it. And once it has finished downloading, I am going to run it. It'll ask you to select your language. You can just click, whatever language you're using. License agreement, I agree. Where do you want to install it? Just leave it by default. Pretty much everything in here you can leave by default. At least at the time of this video, Notepad++ installer does not contain any bloatware, so there really shouldn't be anything too tricky that you have to worry about avoiding. So I'm just going to click install. It usually runs pretty quickly. I don't need to run this at the moment, so I'm going to click finish. Now let's go to my desktop because I'm going to want to open this SQL folder. So I'm going to right click on it and I'm going to click edit with Notepad++. If you try to edit this file in Notepad, usually it's going to be way too big for the standard Notepad editor that comes with Windows to actually open, whereas Notepad++ is going to open this up with no problem. Additionally, in spite of the fact that this all probably looks very confusing to you, this is actually much cleaner looking than it would be in a normal Notepad. So really all we're looking for is a line that says create database. So we're going to use the search function, that's Control F if you're on a Windows, and it's going to ask what do we want to find. Now I'm going to type in create database because that's the line of code that we are looking for. If I click find next and it says it can't find the text, we're all good. So we can exit out. Generally speaking, the create database line would be somewhere in the first 15 or 16 lines. So if you just scan those lines and you use Control F and you don't see it, then you're good. If you do see it, you're going to want to delete the line that says control database. There is a GoDaddy help article that specifically mentions that. Yeah, so if you go to this GoDaddy help article, the one that ends in 5648, which you can access by using the GoDaddy search and typing in 5648, hashtag in front of it, you'll see restoring a MySQL database. It has that note. If you encounter errors when restoring, verify that the create database line is removed. In this case, we've already verified that line is non-existent in here, so we can exit out of this now that we've ensured that the database file should upload without issue. So let's go back over to our cPanel tab that has the database backup tool open. We're going to click on Restore MySQL Database Backup. We're going to browse for the file. In this case, I've already downloaded it to my desktop. You may have downloaded it into your downloads folder, or if you're on a Mac, it could be who knows where. I have no clue when it comes to Macs. So either way, you just need to find the .sql file. If you hover over it, it should say type SQL file, so that's a good sign. And you're going to click open. And you'll see it populates in there. It gives you a green check mark to make sure that the file is okay. And you're going to click on the upload button. Now, once you've clicked on the upload button, it's going to give you this white screen. That's normal. I know it would be a little bit more convenient if you gave you a progress bar or something like that, but in this case, it's not going to give you any of that information. It's just going to give you a white window. Now the good news is that if you kind of know where to look, you'll see that the window is loading here. It's kind of doing some work. And if we look into the bottom left area, you can see that it says sending request to. That's a good sign that things are actually working. If you're not seeing anything that says sending request, or you're not seeing any work going on in the browser tab, maybe give the page 5 to 10 minutes, but if it doesn't seem like it's doing anything, you may need to retry this process in a different website browser. Now, while that's going on, we're going to want to connect to the FTP of the cPanel so we can start uploading the website files that we had downloaded here. As you can see, I've got this folder. It's got all of the WordPress files within it, and we need to FTP this into the cPanel. So in order to FTP into that, we need to disconnect from the old hosting. You can do that by just hovering over this little computer that has a red X, and once you clicked on it and disconnected, it should go to a black X. If for whatever reason that's bugging out, you can just exit out of Filezilla, open a new one, and it shouldn't have anything in there. So from here, what we need to do is we need to access the hosting control panel for cPanel. So just in case you're not on the screen already, go to the person in the top right, go to My Products. Let's scroll down to the web hosting, click on it to expand. We're looking for cPanel, let's click the Manage button. And this is going to have all the settings that we actually need right in here. So the hosting IP address is going to be right under the primary domain. We can just copy this and we can paste it. The next thing we need is the cPanel login. It's going to be right here in the bottom right under the settings, so we can copy that. Paste that. And the last thing that we need is the cPanel password. Now, by default, this password is randomly generated, so you will need to change this password. That you're not going to know what it is. It's randomly generated. So let's click the blue change text. Type in any password that you can remember that meets all of the requirements. Make sure that they match and just click on change password. It'll say we're updating, you've successfully changed. You can exit out and we can go in here. Let's go ahead and type our password in. Port you can leave blank because cPanel also uses the default port of 21, or you can type it in, doesn't really make a difference. And it'll now display our cPanel. Now, as always, it's going to pop you into the root, this /. All of the work we're going to be doing, though, is going to be in the public_HTML folder. So let's scroll down to that. Let's open it. And remember, we are migrating topshelf.deliver. So you're going to want to find the right folder that you're working on. As always, if you're working on the primary domain, you just need to drop it into the public_HTML. If you're working on the primary domain, all of this stuff that you see, in here, other than the CGI-bin, all of this other stuff should be empty. So if you're working on a primary domain, you would just drop all of the content into the public_HTML. So how would you do that, just as an example? Well, you would go into the folder on your desktop, or wherever you have it, that contains your website files. Double click on it to open it, and you're going to select all of the files, and you would drag them over. Now, keep in mind, this is important. You are not just going to drag this folder over into the public_HTML. And that's whether you're working on the primary or whatever. The reason being is that that's not how your hosting server is configured to read the files. The files need to be in very, very specific locations. So make sure that when you're copying the files over from your computer to your desktop, you're actually putting the correct files in the right spot. In this case, since it's a WordPress website, you should always see the wp-admin, these three folders, the admin, content, and includes. Those should all be at the top of the folder. So for a primary domain, as you can see, we've kind of already got a great example here. The primary domain already has these files in here because I've already done that migration. In this case, if this folder was empty for you, you would want to make sure that the three files and all of these other files, etc., were properly located in the public_HTML. Now, in this case, since I'm working on the add-on domain, I'll go to the topshelf.deliver folder. And this is kind of what it would look like if you were working on the primary domain. You would just see CGI-bin and nothing else. Like I said, I'm not just going to drag this folder in there. I can't emphasize that enough. That will not work at all. So I'm going to double click. I'm going to drag all these files in there. I'm going to select all of them, and I'm just going to drag them over. Now we're going to upload this. As you can see, the website is roughly 287 megabytes here, so this upload is probably going to take a decent amount of time. So that's kind of doing its thing. Let's go ahead and check on the database backup that we had made. Perfect. So when we go over to that backup window that we had open, that white screen, it has now loaded properly. One thing I did forget to mention, so that's my bad. When you have that white screen open, please leave that window open. If you exit out of that white screen window, it does stop the database upload. So my bad for not editing that into the window earlier. Now this window here should say determine database name, restoring database, done. If there was some sort of error, usually that's going to be because your database is simply too large, and so you may need to split the database into multiple files and upload them that way. That's a huge pain in the butt, so I'm not going to go into this. And honestly, if you need to go through something like that, I would recommend just paying somebody to migrate your website, because that is very time consuming to do multiple database uploads and splitting it and then re-putting it together and making sure that it works properly. At that point, I would honestly just recommend paying somebody to do it. But in this case, this 70 or 80 megabyte database uploaded just fine, so we're all good. Let's go back to the cPanel home over in this tab. Oh, it still logged us out. Now the reason it's logged us out, I just realized it's because we just changed the cPanel password. Not a big deal. If you go back to your GoDaddy hosting control panel and you click on the blue cPanel admin button, it should generally just log you in automatically, probably 99.9% of the time. If not, well, you know what the username is and you know what the password is because you just changed it, so you can log in that way as well. But either way, once we are back in here, we need to search for the database in order to make a user for that database. So we're going to search for MySQL, and this is going to bring up the MySQL databases. Now, as you can see, our database has been properly uploaded, but there's a problem. We don't have a privileged user. So what we need to do here is we need to make a user for this database. That way it can actually run properly on WordPress. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the database name, and we're going to make that the database username. I always recommend doing this. It's a lot easier if you just keep the database name and username the exact same. So we'll just use the database name as the database username. For the password, you can make that whatever you want as long as you can remember it, because this will be relevant later, so please don't forget your password. We're going to create the user for this database. It's going to say that we've successfully created the user. Let's go back. And now that we can see we have that user that we created there. However, we still see it's not connected to the database. So what we have to do is we have to go add the user that we just created, and we have to select the proper database. Like I said, they should match up. If you're following this guide, your user and the database should have the exact same thing. So we're going to click on add, and it's going to ask what privileges do we want to give it. If you want your website to run properly, you need to select all privileges. Make sure that you are selecting all privileges, otherwise you may lose functionality on the website. So let's click make changes. It's going to say user was added to the database with the requested privileges. We can go back just to double check. And if we check the database, we'll see that it has the user properly added now. So this is going well. We're pretty much about maybe 75-80% of the way done here. Now, while I was doing this, Filezilla did give this message here where its target file already exists. As always, I would highly recommend using overwrite if source is newer. Always use this action. We're just going to click OK. And we're going to continue to let it to upload all of this other stuff here. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause the video because this upload is going to take a decent amount of time, and I'll be back in one moment. So now that we've transferred everything from the desktop to the actual folder for the website, let's go back into the cPanel administrative area. That way we can just verify that everything was done properly there. So what we'll do is we'll go to the cPanel home, and then from the cPanel home we're going to use the file manager. So we'll just search for file manager, click on that. We're going to remember to go to the home directory, show hidden files, we'll click go, and we're going to go to public_HTML. And remember, we're working on the website topshelf.deliver, so I'm going to open up that folder, and you can see that the website contents are in there. Everything's looking proper. We've got the WP admin, WP content, WP includes at the very top of the folder. As I had mentioned earlier, remember we can't simply drop the topshelf.deliver folder in here. We need to actually put the WP contents into the root of the folder. So that's in there properly. So we're almost done here. The next thing that we need to do is we need to fix up the connection strings. The connection strings are going to determine how the website connects to the database. And because we're migrating this content, the connection strings got migrated over, but they're no longer going to work. The reason being is that we've changed the database password. So what was formerly in the database area is not going to work within the connection strings. So if you right click on it, we'll go to edit the wp-config.php file because that is where our connection strings are. So we'll edit the wp-config.php. And I know that this can look a little bit confusing, but all we're really looking for here is MySQL database username, MySQL database password, and the MySQL host name. The only two that we're going to be changing here are going to be the database password and the MySQL host name. The MySQL host name is going to probably look like some very unusual string or something like that because the legacy hosting servers don't always use the same host name that a cPanel would. For cPanel, the host name is always 100% of the time going to be localhost. And you can verify this by going to the wordpress.org listing for editing the wp-config folder. You'll see that the general example is going to be localhost. So any cPanel WordPress website is always going to be using localhost for hostname. So if it doesn't already say localhost when you go in to edit your wp-config.php file, change it to localhost. Now the password is going to be whatever password you had made for your MySQL user. So remember earlier we had created the MySQL user and we made sure that it had the exact same username as the database name. And when we go back over to our file manager, we'll see the database username and the database name itself are the exact same. So those we don't need to change. We just need to update the password. And this is fine. Like if you've somehow already managed to forget your database password, all you have to do is change the password for the database user and you'll be good. I realize this is a little bit misleading. The database password is actually talking about the password for the user that connects to the database. The database itself doesn't actually have any direct password. Like there's no option to set a password on the database. You can only set the password for the user that connects to the database. So we'll go back into our editor here. This is where you're going to type in whatever password you chose. Obviously, in this case, that's not the actual password that I chose, but once you've chosen the password and you've typed it in there properly, you're going to click Save Changes, the blue button in the top right. In case you didn't already tell from these other ones, you are going to leave these little apostrophe signs on the ends of it, so the password goes inside of them, and then you save the changes. And once you've closed out that window, it'll close it out entirely. So now, at this point, we've done the vast majority of the work. All of the files and everything should be good to go for the most part. There is going to be one error with this website, only because we're migrating it from the legacy Windows hosting. If you were migrating from legacy Linux hosting, you wouldn't have to do this part. Anyways, Windows uses a web.config file. Linux and cPanel use a .htaccess file. So we need to actually, in this specific example, create the .htaccess file. If you've already got a .htaccess file in here, you're probably good. You really don't need to touch it, but I'm just going to do this now. So I'm going to create .htaccess in this folder. And I'm going to right click on it, edit it. At the moment, it's empty. So I need to find what should be in here using the WordPress.org website. So I'm going to look up WordPress.org .ht access. It's literally going to be the first result. And this is what's going to be in a .ht access file, at least by default. So I'm going to copy this. We'll go back to the file editor. I'm going to paste this in here. And this will fix up the .ht access. Keep in mind, this is only if you don't have a .ht access file already. So if you're migrating from Linux Classic to cPanel, you probably don't need to do this. So I'm going to save the changes. I will close this out. And then since we're on cPanel now, this web.config file, cPanel doesn't even use web.config. That's a Windows hosting specific file. So I can actually just delete this. And then I have corrected all of the files here. So the last things that we're going to be doing is we're just going to fix up the DNS and the domain name. So I'm going to go back to our hosting. Now earlier in the video I had already removed that domain name from the old hosting account. So all I need to do now to finalize these changes is we need to go back into the cPanel home area. We need to modify the add-on domains. Because earlier when we added it to the cPanel, we added it as new.topshelf.deliver. Obviously it needs to just be topshelf.deliver, so I'm going to remove that. Are you sure you want to permanently remove the add-on domain new.topshelf.deliver? Yes, remove it. I'm going to go back now that it's done. Now in order to finalize all these changes, we've got the website uploaded. We fixed the .ht access file simply because we're on a Linux or cPanel platform now, so we needed the HT access there. All the files are in there, the database is in there. The last thing to do is fix up the domain name. So we need to re-add the domain name, and instead of doing new.topshelf.delivery, we're going to just do topshelf.delivery. And we need to make sure that we're properly pointing to the folder. Earlier I had made a slight mistake in the video where I added the folder as topshelf.deliver. So instead, I'm just going to rename this folder topshelf.delivery because that's the actual name of the website. So I'm going to rename that. Cool. And then I'm going to double check the spelling over here. We just need to make sure that this domain name, topshelf.delivery, properly points to the folder that contains the website files. So the folder is in the public_HTML, and it's named topshelf.delivery. So when we're adding the add-on domain, we should see it as public_HTML/topshelf.delivery. So that all looks good. We're going to add the domain. Cool, looks good. Properly points to the folder, and if I click on it, it does take me into the folder that we were working on. So all we really need to do now is just make sure that the domain name is properly linked to the DNS. So we're going to go ahead and grab the hosting IP address. You can do this by going to your cPanel home area. Usually somewhere on the screen it'll show your website IP address. If not, you can also grab it by hopping into the GoDaddy side, going into your cPanel control area, and you can grab your IP address right there. So let's go ahead and copy that. And then we're going to go to the DNS for this domain just to make sure that it's right. So we'll go to the person in the top right, My Products. And we're going to go down to topshelf.delivery, DNS. Now in this case, cPanel has already properly added the records that we need. We need to make sure this A record with the @ symbol goes to that hosting IP address. In this case, it's 160.153. I can see this begins with 160.153, so it looks good. cPanel will almost always add this stuff properly for you, but it's a very, very smart idea to double check. I have seen maybe extremely rare instances where it wasn't added correctly, or what can also happen is you won't see the records added properly and you're like, I would have sworn I had added it correctly. Usually, if you don't see these records popping in here, 99% of the time it's because you actually misspelled something. So I actually edited it out of this video, but I had initially added this as topshelf.deliver instead of .delivery, and when I hopped in here, I didn't see the records properly in here, so I was like, wait a minute, I did something wrong. So in this case, it all looks good. Anytime we make DNS changes like this, those changes could take up to 48 hours to take full effect. Realistically speaking, I'm going to check the website in maybe 5 to 30 minutes and see whether topshelf.delivery properly loads up. Alright, cool. So I've waited about 5-10 minutes in order to allow the website to kind of propagate and have these DNS changes take effect. So let's try going to the website. Let's see if it pulls up properly. So open a new window, paste and go. Cool. Website loads properly. That means we've done our job. We can go ahead and click around to different links and so on and so forth. Page seems to work properly there. So we've pretty much done our work here. We have successfully migrated everything. So I know that this has been a long video, and that's because migrating a website is a bit of a long process. Additionally, I had to explain things, which kind of slows things down a bit. I do apologize, but I wanted to make sure that I covered all of the potential issues that you can bump into here. Additionally, we just also needed to remember that we needed to make sure that the files were getting uploaded to the right place. So this video has used an add-on domain example. All of the steps are basically the same for a primary domain on cPanel. It's just that instead of going into subfolders of the file manager, such as local BTM or topshelf.delivery, you basically just dump all of the WordPress files directly into the public_HTML. Otherwise, pretty much everything's good here. Make sure to double check everything. Like, one thing that can happen is if you try to go to the website and you receive a database error. If you're getting a database error after you've done all of this stuff, it means that somewhere in the wp-config file, you messed up. So hop in there and make sure to double check the database name, the database username, which if you follow this guide should be the exact same. Make sure to double check your password and make sure that the database host name is set to be localhost. Those will definitely fix up any database errors. The only other time you would get a database error is maybe if during the step where we had actually uploaded the database, you had exited out the window, or you did something that caused the database to not upload properly, in which case, just re-upload the database. Not a big deal. But yeah, just one final reminder, spelling does matter quite a lot here, so if things aren't working, anything like that, double check the spelling in everything that we've done, or maybe just restart the guide from scratch, because we have pretty much gone through everything properly here. So I hope this guide helps you out. I know migrating a website is a long process, but I've tried to do this literally as step-by-step as possible. That way you don't get lost or you don't mess up. And keep in mind, if you are bumping into issues even after you follow this guide and it just doesn't seem to be working properly for you, you can always pay somebody to do this. For this guide, I know that we've been working on GoDaddy websites, or GoDaddy hosting, I should say. GoDaddy has a migration service that does all of this work for you, or at least about 98% of the work for you, and it's $100. So if you're a busy individual and you don't have time to be migrating these websites, but you don't want to pay some IT guy, $200, $300, $400, GoDaddy will do it for you, $100. But otherwise, I hope this guide helped you. Thank you for watching.